Can you imagine Julius Caesar willingly turning back power?
One of the lessons that we get from Roman history is these very strong military leaders who translate that military power into governing.
World history prior to the American Revolution always ended with the successful, victorious general taking power.
I suppose we all have heard, either in high school or somewhere, that the founders had an absolute horror of executive power, having dealt with this tyrant, George III, during the Revolutionary period. But it is a curious thing that they then handed to their new executive very great powers, powers in some ways equal to or exceeding the powers of a king in the British system.
So at the founding, one of the visions of the executive power was that it needed to be vigorous, that it needed to be sufficiently strong, invested with enough power that it would be able to counterbalance the other two branches of the federal government.
The founders were trying to achieve a balanced government, a constitutional government, but one that had a strong executive.
They had solace in the fact that as they were getting this new government up onto its feet, up and running, that George Washington would be the one exerting that influence. Washington became president on April 30th, 1789.
After he becomes president, he writes a letter to a British historian, which is to say he writes it to history, if you will. Few understand the role I had to play. And he uses this wonderful phrase, I walk on untrodden ground. He's aware this is something that's never been done before. It's new.
There were no precedents upon which to judge. So basically everything he did, he was doing from scratch. Every office that he was creating was being created from scratch. Every statute that Congress was passing was being created from scratch.
Washington is very mindful of everything he does, but especially the precedents that will be set by his every action, including what he wears, how he acts, who he meets with, how he does virtually everything. As we get into Washington's second term, this question naturally comes to the fore. We've never done this before. The assumption is essentially that Washington's going to stick around. He's not going anywhere. Indeed, Thomas Jefferson, in one of his letters, assumes that Washington's going to stay for life. Because that's the natural thing to do, and that's historically what it always happened.
History is littered with examples of military men. One thinks after Washington of Napoleon Bonaparte, for example, who seize power and are reluctant to give it up.
There was an enormous concern voiced by the myriad anti-Federalist authors at the time that whoever was given this executive power was going to be effectively a monarch.
In history, the idea of getting power and then giving up power is not only non-existent, but it's absurd. Why would anybody do that? The whole point of getting power is not to give it up.
Cincinnatus was a patrician, one of those fathers of Rome, Republican Rome. He had held the consulship.
And then he had retired to his farm, his little 4 acres of land, and his plow, until 458 BC.
Rome had been besieged by an invading tribe, the Equi.
And so the senators go to Cincinnatus, and they appeal to him to come back and lead them.
They gave him complete autocratic power, total autocratic power, anything he needed in order to win this war, because it was an existential threat to the Republic.
Cincinnatus, this retired general and public servant, the very next morning assumed command of the army and was given this 6-month dictatorship, and in a brief 15 days, a mere 15 days, vanquished the enemy, return Rome to a peaceful footing, and then return the dictatorship. He could have legally stayed on for 6 months and enjoyed all the perquisites of virtually absolute power. But he didn't do that.
Cincinnatus was a thunderbolt of shock and awe at the time.
This story, really becomes a legend, a mythical hero of Rome, which of course is a great example of kind of Roman virtue, the virtue of the Roman, the citizen of Rome, who serves the Republic, who does what is necessary for the Republic, but then does not become a dictator in the sense that we understand the term, which is keeping power, holding power, and maintaining power forever. He uses it, but he gives it back.
Washington was called by many people the Cincinnatus of the West, and the parallels are actually quite striking. There were some attempts to co-opt Washington into either seizing power from the Congress by military force or leading such a venture. There were evidently some movements to try to make him a king following the Revolution. Washington was adamant and, in fact, furious that anyone would try to foist such a plan on him or on the colonies and then the new nation, and said in the strongest terms that this was an anathema to everything that the Revolution was about.
At the end of the war, Washington is going to go to the Congress, which at the time is meeting in Annapolis, and he's going to resign his commission. It's actually an important ceremony. He literally goes there and gives them his sword. His first great resignation.
And so when the King of England, King George, was told about Washington's plans to resign his commission and return to his farm in Mount Vernon, King George said, if he does that, he will truly be the greatest man on earth.
The only model that they had, and that was known because they were students of classical history. They knew it from their Cicero and from other stories of the ancient Romans. The only model they had was this model of this Cincinnatus figure, who seemed so mythical and impossible that you couldn't even believe it. Someone who would come from the farm, take power, save the Republic, give it up. And so Washington takes on this sense of the legend. He's the Cincinnatus figure. He's the American Cincinnatus that understands the role of power, the importance of power, especially in foreign affairs and military affairs. But Washington also understands that a republic requires the giving up of power.
Washington, I think, had never really intended to serve as long as he did. He wanted desperately to get back to Mount Vernon and, like Cincinnatus, to retire to his plow. Instead of going to Congress and deciding to resign or to decline a third term in person, he goes straight to the American people. When he writes this address, it leads with, "To the people of the United States, my fellow citizens."
It was a marvelous moment in the history not only of the United States, but of free government around the world. A peaceful transition of power in a regime of representation where the people elect their representatives. It was an unusual thing, and perhaps it's still an unusual thing today.
One of the things that I think you see in both of these people is a true understanding of civic virtue, a true understanding that, in fact, none of any of this, the conflict, is about them personally. It is instead about the people, the protection of their liberties, the protection of their rights, the protection of their sovereignty.
And I think that one of the great lessons we can learn from Washington is what it takes in a leader, what kinds of virtues does it take in a leader, what kinds of public virtues need to be present in a society to sustain a free government. It's a fragile thing, democracy, a republican form of government. It's a fragile thing.
The comparison between Washington and Cincinnatus is appropriate, understood in the right context, which is to say that I think the comparison is not to say that Washington is just somehow this kind of mythical, classical figure that's wearing a robe, put up on Mount Rushmore for us to admire. The true Washington, this figure, this dynamic figure, who leads the revolution and then leads by becoming the first president, and then leads by stepping down and shifting his own authority to the Constitution itself. That's the true story. That's the actual Washington. And that not only is an amazing thing by any historical standards, but is probably the most significant and powerful example of Republican citizenship that this country has ever produced.
Your fame thus spread to distant lands, may envy's fiercest blasts endure. Like Egypt's pyramids it stands, built on a basis more secure. Time's latest age shall own in you the patriot and the statesman too. Now hurrying from the busy scene where thy Potomac's waters flow, may thou enjoy thy rural reign and every earthly blessing know. Thus he whom Rome's proud legions swayed, returned and sought his sylvan shade.